Hey, welcome back, everyone. So, broadcasting here live from CPAC here in Florida, and it's been nice. That things just started here. Trump is again supposed to speak this Sunday. I'll keep you all updated on that. Just doing some nice interviews. You might see the one we had earlier today with Matt Schlapp, who's one of the guys who's in charge of the whole CPAC meeting. I really explained the whole thing they had this year of you know, basically standing up against this cancel culture. They're calling it America Uncanceled. You check out that interview, check out what he said. I think you'll find it interesting. Had some great interviews today as well. We're going to be posting a lot of them going forward. And actually did a whole bunch of radio shows too, which I wouldn't know how to even share them, to be honest, but probably did about 15 different radio shows today as well. All right, folks. So some good stories for the night. I want to go over some of what's happening with the United Nations right now. You might remember the story actually we had a long time ago from Alex Newman. He's a contributor to the Epoch Times. He does some really great investigative stories. And he had a story a while back on how the United Nations actually provided the Chinese Communist Party with the names of dissidents who were supposed to testify to them about human rights abuses. And the United Nations ended up providing the CCP with the names of these individuals who were then persecuted. And this is relevant now because there's some new evidence that's just come out on this. Some new emails have come out kind of corroborating what we reported before. Also, I want to go over a few other stories, a bit more of what's happening with Biden, a bit more of what's happening with Trump. Be getting into it as well. All right, folks. Yeah, good seeing you all. It's from Chosen and Faithful. Yay, Josh. Good to see you. Thank you. Jen C. Hi, Josh from Malaysia. Jumpin' Janet. How you doing? Madeline, you said, hi, Josh. I'm in Florida. Vacation. Yeah, good stuff. Good seeing you all here. All right, folks. Let's jump into the first story for the night. As always, as well, if you have questions, please leave them in the comments. I'll try to get to them. All right, so the first story, the one I just mentioned, it says here, this is Epoch Times, it says leaked emails confirm UN, meaning the United Nations, gave names of dissidents to CCP. It says leaked emails prove that, contrary to United Nations denials, in other words, they denied it, that UN human rights officials did in fact give the names of Chinese dissidents to the Chinese regime in Beijing before those activists were set to testify in Geneva against the Chinese Communist Party's abuses. So again, these individuals were supposed to testify in Geneva about facing abuses under the CCP, and the United Nations gave their names to the CCP so they couldn't do so. Now it says here, in fact, it appears from the leaked documents that the practice of handing over names of Chinese dissidents to the dictatorship was viewed as a, quote, usual practice by all involved. Now, the whistleblower told the Epoch Times that it continues to this day despite UN denials. The United Nations, the organization, created with this whole idea of uniting the world after World War II and standing up against things like preventing, for example, another Holocaust from happening, is itself practicing to an extent by providing names to a totalitarian genocidal regime, the names of people trying to expose the genocides and persecutions taking place in China. In other words, the United Nations is not only covering it up, the United Nations is participating in this. Now it says here, if the dissident expected to embarrass Beijing at the UN summit was already abroad, the CCP frequently threatened or even kidnapped and tortured the person's family, according to the UN whistleblower Emma Rayleigh, who first exposed the scandal. Now, let me say that again. If the CCP expected this dissident to embarrass the CCP and make the CCP look bad at the United Nations, and they were already abroad, if they couldn't go after the individual, what they did instead, after the United Nations gave them the names of the people, the Chinese Communist Party frequently threatened or even kidnapped and tortured the person's family. This is the United Nations being involved with this by providing the names of these individuals to the UN when it knows they're trying to go abroad to testify. And it says here again, right? Again, that this was usual practice by the United Nations. Quote, usual practice by the United Nations. Now it says here, critics of the regime whose names were handed over by the UN included activists concerned about Tibet, Hong Kong, the Islamic Uyghur minority in Western China, all of which are being targeted by the CCP for various reasons. Let's go over that again. Tibetan Buddhists, right, or Tibetans who are being persecuted by the CCP are among them. They tend to not get much attention these days because they're one of the no-go, you can't talk about it persecutions for the CCP right now, right alongside Falun Gong. All right, can't talk about it, CCP won't have it. Hong Kong, right? The Hong Kong democracy activists, the people who the United Nations and much of the free world has been claiming to support, right, are among the people the United Nations itself has been handing over the names of to the CCP so that they or their families can be persecuted, including acts of torture faced by these people and their families. And also the Islamic Uyghur movement, right? The movement, the religious minority in China, which the persecution of which has now been classified as a genocide in the United States. Names of these individuals trying to make this public, names of people, Muslim Uyghurs, who are being persecuted in China, trying to make this public, the United Nations handing over their names to the CCP, participating in this case in genocide. How is the United Nations itself not being called out for participating in genocide when this is happening? How is the United Nations still seen as an organization standing up for human rights if it is common practice, right, usual practice, for the United Nations to hand over names of individuals trying to expose genocide, knowing that these individuals are going to face persecution or their family members will be threatened or abducted and tortured? This is what the United Nations is participating in, according to this whistleblower and according to newly released emails. Now, let's explain this a bit more. It says in February of 2020, the Epoch Times reported on the scandal and on the retaliation faced by Riley for attempting to expose and halt the practice. This is the whistleblower. So let me explain this a bit. This whistleblower, this Miss Riley, after she exposed what the United Nations was doing, actually, Alex Newman, the author of this investigative piece, actually, he wrote about this before. Alex Newman, in this previous piece, wrote about this whistleblower. This whistleblower at the United Nations made this story public, thinking the United Nations itself didn't know about it and would actually itself act on it. Instead, you know what happened? Riley, the whistleblower, was punished by the United Nations for making it public. They have their own internal court, and she was put on trial in the internal court of the United Nations for exposing the fact that the United Nations itself was exposing the names of people who are facing persecution in China, and these individuals are persecuted because of the actions of the United Nations. Now it says here, Riley's case at the UN is still ongoing right now. She remains employed there, but is under, quote, investigation for exposing these crimes against humanity, this participation in genocide by the United Nations. Now it says here, prominent human rights organizations around the world have slammed the UN practice for endangering the lives of dissidents and their families. In comments to the Epoch Times, Riley described it as criminal, quote, and even argued that it made the UN, quote, complicit in genocide, right? Arguing the UN is, quote, complicit in genocide. It says here, for years, the United Nations denied that its agents were providing the names of dissidents to the CCP. But thanks to leaked emails about the practice, it is now clear that the UN misled its member governments and the press surrounding the scandal. One of the explosive emails in question was sent on September 7, 2012, from a diplomat at the CCP's mission to the UN in Geneva, requesting information on Chinese dissidents set to testify at the UN Human Rights Council. And this is an email obtained by the Epoch Times. It's from a CCP diplomat to a UN liaison with non-governmental organizations, right? This is from a CCP diplomat making this request to a UN liaison. It says this: following the usual practice, could you kindly help me to check whether the persons on the attached list are requesting the accreditation of the 21st session of the HRC, Human Rights Council. My delegation has some security concerns on these persons. And keep in mind, in terms of Chinese Communist Party jargon, when they talk about security concerns, they talk about national security, they mean things that impact the interests of the CCP, things that harm the agendas of the Chinese Communist Party. And it continues here, right? The UN official whose name was redacted from the leaked email responded by confirming that 2 of the dissidents on the CCP's list were in fact accredited and planning to attend. And the the UN official confirmed this. This is what the UN official said from the United Nations. Quote, as per your request, kindly be advised that Dalkan Issa and He were accredited by the Nonviolent Radical Party, Transnational and Trans Party, for the 21st session of the Human Rights Council. Human Rights Council, right? UN Human Rights Council. Now, Issa is the president of the World Uyghur Congress, which advocates on behalf of the Uyghur population of Western China's Xinjiang region that is being brutally targeted by the Chinese Communist Party. It says numerous official sources around the world say the regime is holding more than 1 million Uyghurs in re-education camps. Former detainees who spoke with the Epoch Times revealed that they were being raped, tortured, brainwashed, and savagely abused, right? Get that again. An organization, the United Nations and its Human Rights Council, which actually called out the United States because most of the member states of the Human Rights Council are countries like the Chinese Communist Party, Iran, and other offenders of human rights, right? We're participating, in this case, under the United Nations, in acts of rape, torture, brainwashing, and savage abuse, right? By allowing the CCP to continue these acts and by providing the CCP with names of individuals so they or their families could be persecuted. Now, Issa also serves as the vice president of the Unrepresented Nations and Peoples Organization, the UNPO, which seeks to be a voice for nations and people groups without representation from a nation state of their own. Now, the year after that email, at the request of the regime's delegation, UN security attempted to remove Issa from the Human Rights Council chamber. However, Riley, and only Riley, this whistleblower, intervened and prevented the ouster. Now, I won't go much deeper into this, but you all get the story on this. Actually, let me go over one more part of this, because this one's a big one. The other dissident identified by the UN in its email to the CCP mission is Geng He. And she's the wife of imprisoned Chinese human rights lawyer Gao Zhisheng, a Chinese Christian who wrote a book about the severe torture he was subjected to by the CCP for his work and beliefs. And so here you have the United Nations betraying 2 individuals, one of whom is a Muslim Uyghur, and just in these emails alone, one of whom is a Muslim Uyghur, and another one is the wife of a Christian lawyer in China, Gao Zhisheng, a very famous lawyer, who is standing up again for people facing human rights abuses in China, including, for example, Falun Gong practitioners. He actually wrote a book about it. And again, right, you have Geng He being identified by the identified by the UN to the Chinese Communist Party. And again, something that contributes not just to the persecution of Falun Gong, which Geng He was actually trying to expose because he represented people who were persecuted, but also himself being a Christian. And Christians as well are deeply, very badly persecuted in China. This is the United Nations. And of course, Trump had pulled the United States out of the UN Human Rights Council pretty much because of things like this. And his stance with the United Nations and trying to get issues of human rights addressed was to basically bypass the UN, right? Originally, he was trying to go through the UN, trying to deal with human rights issues, trying to bring up concerns about human rights abuses in China. They were getting nowhere, right? They weren't getting anywhere with the United Nations dealing with that. What did Trump do? He pulled out of the UN Human Rights Council and he started sanctioning the Chinese Communist Party's officials, businesses, and others who were directly involved in these types of abuses directly. And that actually started having an impact. That was the only thing that worked. And now we'll see what happens as, again, the United Nations is put back into the UN Human Rights Council, which itself has been complicit in these types of abuses. All right, let's go over a couple more stories, and then I'll go into some questions. Actually, one more here that's related. This is another Epoch Times story. Get this. Now, does this scene look familiar to you all? Let me show you a picture here. It says, in war against faith, Chinese regime burns religious books and jails believers. Now, what does this picture remind you all of? Does this bring back any images of what happened in the past? I'm sure many of you have seen images very much like this committed by the Nazis in Germany. They're, of course, burning books in a very similar manner. These are religious books. These are not, just random whatever books. These are religious books being burned by the Chinese Communist Party. And it says here, and keep in mind, The Chinese Communist Party, as we speak, is set to be hosting the Olympics coming up. This is the country that is set to host the Olympics very soon. Being an example of bringing nations together and so on, something they're going to use for propaganda to prop up their image, just like they did with the 2008 Beijing Olympics, which was called by many human rights activists the Bloody Olympics. And during the Bloody Olympics in 2008, the Chinese Communist Party took actions to imprison Chinese dissidents because it was afraid that they would come out and make public the persecutions happening in China. You might remember, for example, the protests taking place in China during that time when Tibetan Buddhist monks were being clubbed by Chinese police. And when images emerged as well, when the Chinese Communist Party tried claiming that the Tibetan monks were carrying out the violence, images emerged of Chinese police carrying the robes of Tibetan monks, suggesting, as many people alleged, that Chinese police were dressing in the robes of Buddhist monks to carry out violence. The CCP used the Beijing Olympics in 2008 to increase its persecution of religious minorities in China. And here we have now the Chinese Communist Party again burning books, arresting religious believers, carrying out different types of abuses, while it is still not only getting validated at the United Nations, where it has increased its control, but also, as we've seen as well, getting ready to host the Olympics yet again. Let's go into the story just a bit. So it says here, China's Communist Party has continued its broad attack on faith through the pandemic, burning and trashing religious books while jailing spiritual adherents for possessing religious literature. While the officially atheist Chinese regime formally recognizes 5 religions, Buddhism, Taoism, Islam, Catholicism, and Christianity, it imposes strict rules over how these religious organizations should operate. In other words, it has state-run versions of the religion you can practice, which do not represent the real original religions. They're altered versions that the CCP has approved, basically. Now, into this a bit more. It imposes strict rules, again, over how these religious organizations should operate, and often installs party cadres, CCP officials, to control the entities, forcing millions of spiritual followers to turn underground. In other words, in China, yes, technically the Chinese Communist Party can go up in front of, the United Nations and so on, make statements claiming that China accepts religious liberties, that it recognizes 5 religions, and many Chinese people are able to practice religion freely. But that is a really altered truth. Again, it has 5 altered religions running under the names of religions you and I are familiar with, but are completely different in the basic foundations, meaning that these are organizations populated by, led by, and controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. And the altered versions of these religions are the only ones you're allowed to practice. If you want to practice the real versions of the religion, the ones that exist outside of China, you have to become one of the underground religious believers, underground Christians, underground Catholics, and others. Now, for these believers, Tibetan Buddhists, Christians, Uyghur Muslims, or Falun Gong practitioners, reading, printing, or distributing religious material, like the real religious materials, could lead to jail terms, harsh labor, and other forms of abuse. Many are subject to routine monitoring and harassment by state agents, who often break into their homes without warning to seize and destroy their books. These violations of religious freedom have led the U.S. State Department to designate the Chinese regime as a, quote, country of particular concern every year for more than 2 decades. Now, the repressive policies have only intensified in recent years. In 2016, the regime, meaning the Chinese Communist Party, passed a regulation explicitly banning its roughly 90 million party members from having religious beliefs. If you're a CCP official, you are banned from having religious beliefs. You're forbidden from engaging in, quote, feudal superstitions, which is one of the terms they use for religious beliefs. Again, from engaging in religious activities, right? They call feudal superstitions, or supporting religious extremists or radical separatists. And look, with the Chinese Communist Party, religious extremism is a term basically used to persecute people. In this case, too, radical separatists could mean Tibetans, could mean people in Taiwan, could mean anybody who supports democracy or freedom in China. Now, I won't go too much deeper into this. Let's move on to a few questions, and then I'll go into some more stories for the night. All right, let's see here. The drink tonight, by the way, is good old-fashioned tea. It's in a Starbucks cup. I brought my own tea this time traveling. It's plain black tea. All right. Let's see. There's a question from the one and only Pinky Pinky. He said, "Are you going to film Trump's speech? I hope you get a chance to interview him, or at least Donald Trump Jr. We'll see." Um, so I did, of course, I'm at CPAC. Trump is scheduled to speak here on Sunday, I believe, early afternoon. I have heard though. Sorry. I have heard though that Trump is going to be speaking in like a off-site room or a room here that not everyone's going to be allowed into, and that the only people in there are going to be media organizations. Sorry, and it's actually unclear which media are going to be allowed in. You know, the problem we had before when it came to even when Trump was in office was that the press pool, meaning the organization that gets to decide who is actually let into, the room to interview Trump and follow him around, that press pool is controlled almost entirely by these media organizations, these legacy media organizations, meaning that, independent journalists, independent media like Epoch Times, we weren't allowed into the press pool. We were let into, for example, the White House press conferences, but that was about it. And even then, we didn't have a whole lot of access. That was just the reality of it. We'll have to see what happens with Trump now that he's out of office, which media will be allowed in to actually film. Hopefully we will be allowed in. And if we are allowed in, we're going to be, of course, broadcasting that at least on our website. We'll have to see if YouTube lets us stay up. All right. Let's see. This question is from, let's see. Sorry, folks. Without the super chat, it's hard for me to follow the questions. Let's see. I'm going over a few of your questions right now. This is from Nikki Bobby. You said there were more than 100 million Falun Gong practitioners in China before the CCP murdered and tortured them. The CCP will pay eternally. Yeah, the Chinese, we don't actually know how many people are killed in the persecution of Falun Gong in China, but there were an estimated, at the time when the persecution was launched, there was an estimated 70 million to 100 million people practicing, and who knows how many were persecuted to death. There really hasn't been any real investigation in China into the full extent of it. This is from Beth Coddington. He said, "Joshua, is this the entire UN or just individuals complicit in this?" Thank you. Well, this is specifically, it seems, the UN Human Rights Council. But it's, again, broader now, the entire United Nations, because this individual, the whistleblower, is herself facing, an internal, basically, trial within the United Nations under the whole United Nations as an entity. And, it is terrible. I don't know, maybe there are good branches of the UN. I'm sure there's a lot of good people there. I've met UN officials before who seem like decent people. I'm sure it's not all of them. But, this is what's happening right now, unfortunately. All right, folks, let's go to the next story for the night. Give me one sec. Now, you might remember I mentioned briefly on I think last Q&A, and actually talked briefly with Matt Schlapp this morning about this. Talked briefly with Matt Schlapp this morning about this. You can watch the interview here at CPAC. That right now there are two Democrats in the House trying to pressure independent businesses, right? Cable companies, different broadcast companies, to censor, to remove from their services Fox News, Newsmax, and OANN. Basically, the three of the few independent and not Fox, but conservative voices in the news industry. Right, there really aren't that many independent news agencies in general, and there are very few conservative news agencies. Now, Fox is, of course, more Republican, I'd say, than actual conservative. But again, in my personal assessment, I think it's good to have different viewpoints, whether they be liberal or Republican, or Democrat or Republican. But let's explain what's happening right now with this. There's been an update on it. It says here, top Republican compares House Democrats' attempt to deplatform Fox News with CCP censorship. It says here, the top Republican House member on the House Energy and Commerce Committee on Wednesday criticized an attempt by House Democrats to pressure television carriers to deplatform Fox News and two conservative news channels. Ranking member Kathy McMorris Rogers, Republican from Washington, expressed her concerns regarding letters sent by 2 Democratic members on the panel to 12 cable, satellite, and streaming companies. The letter accused the companies of not taking steps to combat the spread of what the Democrats said was, quote, misinformation. They demanded answers on why carriers were offering their services to these television outlets. And McMorris Rogers said this: elected officials using their platform to pressure private companies to censor media outlets they disagree with. That sounds a lot like actions from the Chinese Communist Party, not duly elected representatives of the United States Congress. Here we cherish free speech and a free independent press. We believe in dialogue and in the battle of ideas. Rather than censor and silence constitutionally protected speech, the answer is more speech. That's the American way. And she reminded the committee that it was their duty to uphold the First Amendment. As elected officials, they are sworn to uphold the Constitution. And said this, quote, it's foundational to our personal rights and liberties. So we should all be troubled today on what appears to be an attack on the First Amendment by elected officials to coerce private companies to censor political speech. Now, the letters were sent by Representatives Jerry McInerney and Anna Eshoo, who claim, these are the Democrats, who claim that right-leaning Fox, Newsmax, and One American News had, quote, spread in misinformation about the November 2020 elections and about COVID-19. These 2 Democrat House members asked carriers to provide details on what moral or ethical principles they apply in deciding which channels to carry, how many subscribers tuned in to the networks in the weeks preceding the presidential election, and whether they've taken adverse actions against any channel in the wake of the election or on January 6th, or on the January 6th storming of the U.S. Capitol. Now, keep in mind, remember back in 2016, when different media outlets, including many of the major ones, were publishing articles about the integrity, for example, of our election systems, were pressuring, for example, elected members who were set to cast electoral college votes, who were, for example, threatening members of Congress after you had an individual, for example, open fire with a gun and shoot many Republican members of our government who were playing baseball in a field. How many of them were held accountable for that? Remember when you had actors, comedians going on camera and holding what appeared to be severed heads of the U.S. President, Donald Trump, in acts of trying to, make theatrics or something like that? Remember how you had rappers making videos pretending to assassinate the president? Remember when we had, for example, different officials calling for people to go out, right? To go out, for example, and if they see people on the streets, if they see these officials on the streets, to go out and make sure they know they're not welcome. Remember, for example, when these individuals supported protests where people burned down their cities, looted stores, and committed acts of murder. Right? Remember when all this happened? Now, did these officials try to pressure these people who made these calls, including most of the mainstream media? Were these individuals pressured, right? Were the media pressured for spreading, say, calls to violence? Were they pressured over their lies, for example, about the Russia hoax? Were they pressured, for example, about backing the backing the World Health Organization under the UN, when it was lying to the American people and lying to the world at the behest of the Chinese Communist Party? Well, not that I saw. And here you have elected officials right now calling for 3 of the biggest news outlets of the, say, conservative voices to be not just silenced, but deplatformed, to have their businesses destroyed. And, one thing you have in this country is, of course, we have the First Amendment, which protects our freedom of speech. And yes, I know the narrative right now is, and I've heard a lot of Democrats say it, actually, these days. It's kind of surprising because usually they're the ones against big business, but this is, what they're saying, and they're kind of right. They're saying that you can't call, for example, Twitter or Parler or different organizations censoring people based on speech they don't want. You can't really call that violations of the First Amendment. But I'd say it changes once you add into the mix the issue, right? Once you add to the mix the issue that they're doing so censoring under pressure from the government, because the government has interest in censoring these voices, as they are publicly stating they have interest in censoring these voices, but they can't do it through government action, through law, because doing so would violate the First Amendment. So what are they doing instead? They're using their connections to big business to pressure big business to censor. In other words, you have government basically bypassing law to go directly to businesses to pressure them to censor in ways that doing so themselves would be violating the First Amendment. And I think this is where we're at. And oftentimes too, remember, how much money does government pay to these media companies? How much money does government pay to Twitter? How many political campaigns have very lucrative, very large businesses running, for example, PR and advertising campaigns on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, and others? How many of them, for example, pay a lot of money into these organizations through different government projects? It's a lot of money. You're talking just individual states, a lot of money, not to mention the federal government. And when you have this overlap, when you even have government deals with these businesses, this overlap, the threat of them, say, coming after these organizations, if nothing more, right? If nothing more than just directing their constituents and others to attack them and pressure them to drop these voices, to drop these outlets, right? You have them threatening, essentially through government action, using their positions of power, threatening individual businesses to censor, or they risk possibly losing government funding. This is where it's at right now with these big businesses. Yeah. Anyways, I'll keep you updated on this. Now, we'll have to see whether the rest of the House Democrats get behind this. Again, just being fair, this is only 2 House Democrats pushing for that. This is not every Democrat in the House going after this. Not every one of them. This is 2 Democrats going after these media outlets, trying to pressure these businesses. So this is not like at least doesn't seem to be a whole of, Democrat movement type thing. It's 2 individuals doing this. But I will keep you all updated on that. All right, let's go over a couple more questions here. As from Jeff Gordon, he said, Josh, what are your thoughts on CCP giving weapons to ISIS, but concentration camps for Uyghurs, halal organ harvest? Yeah, so this is an odd situation you have with the Chinese Communist Party and its influence in state sponsors of terrorism like Pakistan, Iran, and other countries that are close to the Chinese Communist Party. Now, the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, is persecuting brutally, including with slave labor, including with organ harvesting, including, for example, with re-education through labor re-education camps, including with really strict social controls, even, for example, putting CCP agents in the homes of individuals, normal citizens in these countries. In these areas where you have, again, the persecuted Muslim Uyghurs, making them stay, for example, with women, and there have been allegations of sex crimes because of that. This is happening in China. Now, most of the radical Islamist world, not the average Muslim, but radical Islamists, right, view the United States as, the great Satan and things like this. And this is the narrative propped up by a lot of these real radical public leaders. I could go in depth into the more socialist branches that overtook these Islamist governments, the government systems, not the religion. This goes back to, there was a book, basically through the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood. There was basically a rewriting of Islam, which merged it with socialism, and this became the Egyptian model of Islam that led to a lot of these revolutions that swept a lot of the Muslim world. Didn't get into all the countries, which is why you have the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and other countries that don't really align with some of these other principles like you have in Iran. But in these countries like Iran, where you have governments basically posing as religious leaders, and where criticizing the government is made equal in this case to criticizing the religion, and you can be killed for it. These regimes that have used religion to basically maintain totalitarian rule, side with the Chinese Communist Party, back terrorism and back movements like this, but they don't criticize the Chinese Communist Party when the CCP is persecuting, murdering, harvesting the organs of, and using Muslims as slave labor. They don't criticize it. They actually pretty much tolerate the CCP doing that, or even encourage them to do it in some ways, saying, oh, well, maybe they deserve it. Something that totally goes against the narratives they claim to uphold. And yes, what you have right here is the Chinese Communist Party backing a lot of these terrorist organizations, backing these movements, supplying them with guns. And, it's not really talked about much. The Chinese Communist Party is really one of the biggest backers the drug trade. One of the biggest suppliers of illegal weapons through companies like Norinco, China's Norinco. Weapons that go, for example, to Latin America that are used by the drug cartels there. Some of the articles on it, for example. Even supplying, for example, a lot of the drug trade happening in Latin America. And keep in mind, a lot of terrorist movements are financed by the drug trade. If you go into Latin America, for example, you even have, there's Hezbollah and Hamas. I was getting confused. I think it's Hezbollah is the one very active in Latin America, including to the extent that they have a political party in Peru. And these organizations finance themselves through the drug trade and then use the drug money to gain more power and control over the region, which the CCP works directly with. And so, yeah, the CCP is deeply involved in terrorism, deeply involved in drugs, and deeply involved in these things that they claim to really oppose, right? All right, let's go over the next story for the night. Now, I'm not sure many of you heard about the Equality Act. So the Democrats in the House have passed this Equality Act. And let me explain what this is. I'll go into it. Yeah, Randy Ben, you're mentioning meth. Yeah, the CCP is the biggest supplier, the main supplier of the precursor chemicals for the drug meth, as they are many of the synthetic drugs like synthetic opioids and stuff that are poisoning American kids. But let's go over the story here. It says Democrats Equality Act narrowly passes without hearings. They bypassed the hearing stage. GOP says religious freedom is being harmed. Let's go into this. It says House Democrats approved the Equality Act of 2021 the afternoon of February 25th, following a rancorous debate in which Republicans asserted the controversial bill will significantly narrow the scope of religious freedom if it becomes law. Now, the Equality Act prohibits discrimination due to gender identity or sexual orientation. 3 Republicans joined all 221 Democrats in the lower chamber to support the passage, while the remaining 208 Republicans opposed the proposal that was approved as expected. The 3 GOPers voting with the Democrats included John Katko, Tom Reed of New York, and Brian Fitzpatrick of Pennsylvania. Now, a similar version of the bill was approved by the Democrat House in 2019, but it failed to make it in the Republican-controlled Senate. Passage in the Senate is again somewhat in doubt, as the upper chamber is equally split between the two parties, with Vice President Kamala Harris, again Vice President, who supports the proposal to cast the deciding vote in the end of a tie. We'll have to see. They actually might be able to pass it in the Senate, but we'll have to see. Now, the House debate got hot. I won't go into some of the back and forth with this. There was a lot of arguing back and forth between Republicans and Democrats, of course. But the 500-page bill redefines public accommodation. Basically what it does, right? 500 pages. It essentially redefines public accommodation in the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to include, quote, any establishment that provides a service, including churches, homeless shelters operated by religious groups, adoption agencies, and educational institutions associated with faith-based denominations and associations. And as Jordan pointed out, the bill explicitly sets aside a provision of RFRA that specifically protects the rights of religious groups to conduct their activities and manage their affairs according to their beliefs. Now, let me skip ahead a bit because I won't go over this whole thing. But prior to the debate, religious freedom advocates interviewed by the Epoch Times said the measure, if it becomes law, will put religious institutions at a serious disadvantage in federal and state courts when facing discrimination allegations. And this is according to Mike Berry, general counsel for the First Liberty Institute, told the Epoch Times, quote, Equality Act would eviscerate the protection offered by federal law for those Americans who seek to live out their faith in their schools, businesses, and communities, relegating people of faith to lower class status. And continues, quote, religious and nonprofit schools that violate the bill could lose their taxes exempt status, and schools could lose accreditation, which means they could not accept student loans, and many graduates would not be able to be accepted into graduate school. The expanse of the bill includes church and college overnight stays with youth and or students, dorms, sports, bathrooms, locker rooms, and showers. Now, in other words, now, folks, if you have values that are different from the mainstream, approach, I guess, or the one being pushed at least when it comes to sexual values, you could be persecuted essentially for having values different from what is being pushed by the government. Now, we'll have to see what happens with this. This is being pushed right now by the House, approved by the House, not yet approved by the Senate. We'll have to see if it passes. It actually might. Democrats have a supermajority. You might, however, see some lawsuits on this, and it's going to be really interesting actually going forward, right? What's going to be very interesting going forward actually is going to be watching whether this includes other things. Now, we'll have to see how they word this, but it could actually turn out, for example, that maybe they make the language so broad that, for example, censoring based on creed, like religion, right, religious persecution, could be deemed as well a crime. That censoring, for example, based on belief could be labeled as a crime. That any kind of violation of equality could be labeled as a crime. And you'll probably see a lot of court cases on this, even going to the Supreme Court, to see whether this law itself is in the end, constitutional. Now, again, I'll keep you all updated on this. It has again passed the House, not yet passed the Senate. You do have a 50-50 split in the Senate between Republicans and Democrats. And Kamala Harris, being the vice president, is the tie-breaking vote. And so we'll have to see. They might be able to pass it. All right, next story here I want to go over. This is actually an interesting pushback on this. It says conservative groups launch movement to protect children from gender identity politics. And it says here, a coalition of conservative groups is asking parents and lawmakers to join a movement that seeks to take gender identity and sexual orientation politics out of a child's upbringing. The, quote, Promise to America's Children initiative seeks to protect children and parents who wish to subscribe to traditional or religious views of gender, sexuality, abortion, and life from being coerced to comply with government policies that penalize them for not doing so. It was launched by the Heritage Foundation, Family Policy Alliance, and Alliance Defending Freedom. Now, I've said before, take what you will, whatever your stance is on sexual values and so on. The problem you have when government gets behind it, though, especially with this, absolute liberalism stance. This is my, purely my analysis. The problem you have with any kind of stance like this is that the only accepted value, right, by the government, by this, say social justice stance, the only accepted value is no values. It's an inversion of good and evil, right? An inversion of right and wrong. The only thing that's deemed wrong is to say that what they're doing is wrong, right? Any act is okay. Any kind of act is okay under these narratives. Well, the only thing that is not okay is if your values say that I don't think that's a good thing. If you have values, this means, right? If you have sexual values, if you have values when it comes to sexuality, you have your own stance when it comes to sexuality, the only accepted value under this government policy is the absolute abandonment of values in this regard. That is the only thing that is acceptable. If you are, if your gender identity is heterosexual, right, you are not allowed to have that. You're not allowed to state that. You're not allowed to promote that. Which is ironic because if they're actually trying to protect people's identity, how can people be denied the ability to have identities other than the most extreme of these narratives, the most extreme of these? In other words, by the very nature of claiming to support, for example, a person's choice when it comes to gender identity, when it comes to sexuality, they are eliminating people's choice of gender identity and sexuality. One of the big issues I have personally with narratives and government policy like this. I couldn't care less what people choose, to be honest, But what I don't like is when government tries to force it on people, when it's not just tolerance, right? Tolerance being you have your views, I have mine. I may not agree with your views, but I tolerate your views, as opposed to forced coercion or forced adherence, right? Where you're forcing someone to state against their will or against their beliefs that what you're doing is good. You are forcing them to adopt values in that case, which is totally different. All right, let's see here. Another question. This is from, This is from Carrie Ann Clissold. He said, Josh, is there actually anybody in China that will investigate these crimes? So you mean when it comes to, for example, the persecutions? There are actually a lot of whistleblowers in China. Actually, one of the individuals I mentioned, the wife of whom was one of the people identified by the United Nations to the CCP, Dr. Gao Zhisheng, our lawyer. Actually, in China, he's a Christian, he's a lawyer, and actually he's been really active in exposing the Chinese Communist Party's persecution of Falun Gong and of other religious groups, including Christians. Gao Zhisheng, this human rights lawyer in China, he actually wrote some books. You can find them on, I think, Amazon. Check him out, Gaogissheng, I believe. An incredible man. Unfortunately, the last I've heard, his whereabouts are still unknown. He was abducted by Chinese Communist Party authorities, and he's frequently abducted. It's not really clear what's happened to him. But he has been one of the biggest whistleblowers in China on this. Epoch Times, actually, we get a lot of leaked documents from inside China about human rights abuses taking there. Actually, there's a lot I could report on a regular basis on this. Maybe I'll include a bit more on it because it is a big deal. You can also check out a website. I think it's run by House Christians. It's called Bitter Winter, Bitter Winter. They do a lot of news on, including getting photographs from inside China from whistleblowers on the CCP's abuses and restrictions on religion. Really, some really in-depth stuff. I think we're asking, though, is there a government body that will investigate these types of abuses happening in China? The Chinese Communist Party is not going to investigate it, and they will not allow external groups to go and investigate human rights abuses in China. Basically, when it comes to diplomacy, the Chinese Communist Party has 5 no-go topics. And I'll get into this because they're putting this on Biden again right now. The Chinese Communist Party has 5 no-go topics on diplomacy. These no-go topics are the persecution of Falun Gong, the persecution of Muslim Uyghurs, the persecution of Tibetans, Taiwanese independence, and Hong Kong democracy. If you mention these issues in, say, diplomatic discussion with the Chinese Communist Party, typically they'll get up and they'll walk out of the room, meaning that this is how they pressure. If you want to negotiate with them, if you want to talk about, policies with them, you can't bring up these topics, or that is the end of the debate. And if you try to talk about them on the Chinese internet or so on, you could just get kicked off or banned. Yeah. Now, actually, on that note, too, the Chinese Communist Party has reestablished, because Biden's talking about re-engaging with the CCP diplomatically, they've reestablished 3 new topics, which are red line topics. I need to actually go a bit into what's happening with that. I did mention, according to Philipp, I did mention persecution of Tibet. That's one of the 5 no-go topics they have. Yeah, bizarre stuff, right? All right, let me skip ahead a bit because I want to go over a few other stories here. All right, there's another story here. It says Democrats' $1.9 trillion relief bill is neo-socialist wish list, according to Senator John Kennedy. Let me explain this just a bit. Now, it's unclear whether they're going to be able to pass this, but Republicans are rallying right now against Democrats' proposed $1.9 trillion COVID-19 relief bill, with Senator John Kennedy, Republican, saying the latest to pan the package as a wish list of liberal spending priorities unrelated to the pandemic. Now, he made the comments on Fox News' America's Newsroom on February 25th when he alleged that basically it's mind-numbing, the stuff they're doing. Now, he said the motto of the Biden administration seems to be, we can't spend too much. Again, he's a Republican, right? Let's go into this a bit, though. Kennedy took aim at controversial provisions in the American Rescue Plan Act. We're going to keep in mind the language here. American Rescue Plan. Remember how much money they sent to other countries with the last rescue plan? Remember how they promised every American $2,000 or $1,600, and they ended up giving us $600, something like that, while they were giving money unrelated to the virus to other countries like Pakistan and others. Now, basically, this thing includes such spending priorities as $750 million for the global response to COVID-19, $270 million for arts and humanities endowments, $200 million for museums and libraries, and $100 million for an electric train in Silicon Valley. Now, the Louisiana senator, again, said this isn't a coronavirus bill. This is a left-of-Lenin, neo-socialist wish list. He said, I haven't seen a Republican yet that's found something in there that they agree with. And this is, again, House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy. And continued quote, "I think all Republicans believe in three simple things: that they want to build that puts us back to work, back to school, and back to health. This bill is too costly, too corrupt, and too liberal." Now, there's been a lot of back and forth in this, but you really see some of the same stuff happening with the last relief bill, namely that there's a lot of stuff in, a lot of talk about helping the average American, but really not much to actually help the average American, right? A lot of the money went to other countries. A lot of money went to programs totally unrelated to the virus. And a lot of money went basically to financing institutions, businesses, and so on that really have nothing to do with the average American or things that actually help them through this crisis. I won't go too much deeper into this, but you get the idea with that one. Just very briefly, news update. This new CCP virus strain is now spreading allegedly very quickly in New York. Actually, at a time when, ironically, you have a lot of states trying to reopen because, again, why do they need lockdowns now, right? Let's go over this. It says, new research suggests that a new strain of COVID-19, the CCP virus, called B.1.526, is spreading quickly in New York and features mutations associated with higher viral infectivity and greater resistance to antibodies. Now, who knows what's going on with the virus right now? Who knows? Take it for what it's worth. There's a lot of competing narratives. And, we saw this, over the whole past year, that, you have one report coming out saying one thing, another report saying something that totally contradicts it. Questioning the mainstream narrative is not allowed, or you're spreading misinformation, and maybe to these two House Democrats will try to get your entire media blocked by big business. This is the wild nature of the reporting on the virus, is that no reporting outside the basic common narrative is allowed. And investigations beyond the common narrative is deemed conspiracy theory, even if the claims in those investigations are later proven to be true, like some of the investigations I've done. Remember the documentary I did last year, for example. And so really it's hard to tell what the case is. You do have some states trying to open up right now, end the lockdowns. You do have some states looking to keep it closed. You do have Dr. Fauci talking about basically things never going back to normal, possibly. You have countries like Israel. Actually, my cameraman is Israeli. He was telling us actually something interesting. He was saying that in Israel right now, they have these passes, these green cards, that basically, if you've gotten your virus vaccine, you're allowed some basic freedoms back. You can go to the gym and things like this. And they're encouraging people to get the vaccine. And if you don't get the vaccine, you basically don't get your freedoms back. Meaning, what does this mean? Well, it means going forward in some countries, based on that same policy, freedom is no longer a right. Freedom is a privilege granted to you by the government for complying. And this is one of the results we're seeing in some countries, at least, from these virus lockdowns, when governments have been given pretty much total control over the populations, their freedom of movement, their freedom of speech, like news articles, being able to state things freely, and other things like that. And I know, for example, that some of the companies creating the technologies for these types of lockdowns, actually I was speaking to some folks here at CPAC about it, they're actually even sending packages of information to U.S. elected officials trying to create the same types of policies here. Now, we'll see how it goes with this going forward, but again, keep you all updated on that. All right, folks, go over a couple more stories here. It's getting a bit late. Let me go over a couple more. Now, real quick on this. Now, just real quick, some of you mentioned there's been a bombing in Syria. Yes, it does seem to be the case. I did see some news articles on it, but I haven't looked into it too much yet, that Biden has again carried out a U.S. strike in Syria. I need to look into it more. I'll keep you updated on it. But let me go into this update real quick first. Now, it says here, House Democrats want Biden to give up sole authority to launch nuclear weapons. Now, this is a bizarre story because House Democrats want Biden to give up the sole authority to launch nuclear weapons, but House Republicans are actually arguing that he should retain sole authority. Now, how does this work? I'll give you my thoughts on it, but how does this work? When the Democrats are the ones trying to restrict Biden's powers as president, and the Republicans are the one who want to let him keep those powers as president, powers to be the sole authority to launch nuclear weapons. See, it seems like an inversion of the normal narrative, right? Let me explain this. Look over it real quick. It says here, Several dozen House Democrats signed a letter asking President Joe Biden to give up his sole authority to launch nuclear weapons and, quote, consider modifying, quote, the command and control of the U.S. nuclear forces. And the letter says, vesting one person with this authority entails real risks. It's a past presidents have threatened to attack other countries with nuclear weapons or exhibited behavior that caused other officials to express concern about the president's judgment. They're obviously probably talking about Trump here. And they continue on this, stating this. While any president would presumably consult with advisors before ordering a nuclear attack, there is no requirement to do so. The military is obligated to carry out the order if they assess it is legal under the laws of war. Under the current posture of U.S. nuclear forces, that attack would happen in minutes. Now, keep in mind, why is it that the U.S. nuclear arsenal actually works? Well, it's because it's pretty much a dead man switch, honestly, right? Nuclear defense is basically a dead man switch. It's to ensure mutual destruction if a country were to use nuclear weapons against the United States. They're not really used outside of a doomsday scenario. The problem is if you have multiple layers of approval to launch it, that whole mutually assured destruction goes out the window. It could go to multiple individuals, some of whom might be compromised, knowing how the CCP has penetrated our government at this point, some of whom might be compromised, meaning that you no longer have mutual destruction, meaning that one country, like the Chinese Communist Party, could launch nuclear attacks against the United States, and the process of getting approval for a counterattack might have so many different hearings and arguments and so on, that the U.S. could never actually respond to it, meaning that the entire purpose of the U.S. nuclear arsenal as a deterrent for nuclear war basically stops existing. The other side of this too is that, keep in mind, this is beyond Biden. They're looking to basically remove this power from the president, meaning that if Trump does get reelected in 2024, Trump would no longer have this type of power. And so it's quite bizarre. And yeah, real quick, Ron Buckner, you're saying, Josh, this is not something the legislature can ask for. A declaration of war has to be left to our chosen leadership. And actually remember, too, that's a good point. And remember, too, actually on that Trump was challenging, that Trump was facing challenges like that from the Democrats during his last days in office, where they were trying to remove his ability to mobilize the military. And yes, that is a power solely granted to the president currently. And if they change that, it means that the next president no longer gets that. Which is interesting, again, because on the surface, it seems like Democrats are actually pressuring Biden on something, and Republicans oddly are going against it. And, without the context, it doesn't actually make a lot of sense, right? Another story here. It says here, Biden revokes 7 Trump executive orders, offers no explanation. And it says, offers no explanation probably because the mainstream media isn't actually questioning him on it, right? He doesn't have to have transparency or make statements when pretty much the whole media is, just bootlicking essentially at this point. Let's go into this. It says President Joe Biden revoked 7 executive orders on February 24th issued by President Donald Trump between 2017 and 2021, essentially unraveling Trump's executive orders during Trump's entire time in office. It says the White House offered no explanation for the revocation in its formal press release. Biden's actions revoked one of the first executive actions Trump signed upon taking office, an executive order entitled Core Principles for Regulating the United States Financial System. The order set out the Trump administration's policy on financial regulation, with the first listed goal to, quote, empower Americans to make independent financial decisions and informed choices in the marketplace, save for retirement, and build individual wealth. That policy also sought to, quote, prevent taxpayer-funded bailouts and to, quote, enable American companies to be competitive with foreign firms in domestic and foreign markets. Now, why would Biden get rid of something that prevents taxpayer-funded bailouts? Right? Your tax dollars going to bailouts of big businesses, like Obama did, for example, in 2008, during the financial crash under Obama, right? Why would he remove an executive order that enables American companies to be competitive with foreign firms in domestic and foreign markets? Why would he remove an executive order that empowers Americans to make independent financial decisions and informed choices in the marketplace, save for retirement, and build individual wealth? Well, he's not answering this. He's not giving any kind of answer on those questions. Now, I won't go too much deeper into this, but essentially what you have happening in my analysis is Biden is basically unraveling everything Trump did. It seems to be the case. Democrats, the old school, the old guard Republicans are basically trying to pretend that Trump never happened, right? They're trying to bring back the old ways of doing things. They're rolling back all the changes Trump made to the country, getting rid of all the Trump executive orders, trying to erase the memory of Trump and trying to criminalize the support of Trump in some cases, right? As we see them doing, for example, with the Capitol siege narrative. Now, why is this interesting? It's because, it's complicated, right? Let me go into this just a bit. Basically, right now, Trump changed the culture of the United States, just like Obama changed the culture of the United States. Really, a lot of the Black Lives Matter protests, the whole transsexual movement, that was, Obama's contribution to changing the culture in the United States. Trump changed the culture of the United States by bringing back the idea that government serves the people, not the people serving the government. Right? The whole idea was taking these, removing some powers from those in power and giving it back to the people, as this executive order actually encompasses, right? And by doing that, Trump actually did relieve a lot of this government pressure on the average American. Now, what happens when you start undoing this? What happens is you start unraveling these things. Now, the media was criticizing Trump every step of the way, making him sound like Hitler and all these things like this, right? That was their actual words, right? They were unraveling all these things and basically trying to pretend like none of this actually happened, rolling it all back, erasing all this. Now, what happens as they do this? People are going to see whether Trump's policies were beneficial or not. As these things are removed, they're going to again feel the pressure of having them removed. After Trump, for example, changed the power structures, changed these things, people are going to see what it's like to get something and then have it taken away once again. And as they again move on with this, right, as they move on again with this whole push, really people are going to have to feel and see the effects of what Trump had actually done with this country. Now, we'll see how it works. We'll see whether, again, in the end, this actually benefited the country. We'll see whether, not allowing American tax dollars to be used to bail out big banks and so on is actually something the American people need or not, right? We'll have to see. But one thing's for sure. Again, Trump is set to speak at CPAC. I'm here at CPAC in Florida. He's set to speak here on Sunday. I'll keep you all updated on that. And one of the things Trump has announced is that he's going to be starting this new grassroots movement under the office of the former president. Now, Trump, for the last 4 years, was president of the United States, right? And people who supported the Trump movement were really not directly engaged. They supported the Trump movement. It meant going to Trump rallies, cheering on Trump, supporting Trump, and so on. That was the Trump movement, right? They saw Trump as someone fighting for them in government. That is top down. That's presidential level, controls the country, and so on. That's not something that changes the country from the grassroots. And it's something I've been saying for a long time too, that, even with Trump, even if he got back in another 4 years, he's president, you have in this country roughly half of the country at this point, being pushed towards a very far left position. I wouldn't say every Democrat right now is in any way socialist, but you do have a lot of them leaning towards socialism. You do have very far left people subverting the party like the Squad and trying to drive them towards that direction. For example, this new Equality Act just being one of many examples on this. Now, what Trump is going to be doing is totally different. He's going to be working on the grassroots up. And that is when the entire dynamic of movement changes. Now, when that changes, right? When that changes, what you're going to have, instead of people cheering on Trump and supporting the president and saying he's fighting for us in Washington, is people actually getting involved in the grassroots. People actually going out and protesting, people actually going out and polling, people actually going out and doing voter registration drives, people actually getting active. And this is something that the conservatives really haven't done much of. Say what you want about, everything. You had Democratic Socialists of America, DSA, and groups like Freedom Road Socialists doing voter registration drives all across the country, especially in key swing states. They were deeply involved in this stuff. Republicans were almost totally disengaged with this because they thought Trump is doing it for us, no need, right? No need. He has this in the bag. Why bother? Trump now is going to be working on the MAGA movement, the Make America Great Again movement, from the grassroots level. And from that grassroots level, we're going to see, for example, him by 2022, which means probably starting very soon, supporting candidates, meaning campaigning, meaning getting out on the streets, meaning voter registration drives, meaning news articles, meaning social media posts, and so on, making the case for the MAGA movement, making the case for the MAGA narrative. This whole movement is about to see life like we've never seen it. This whole movement is about to see more vitality and more grassroots voices than we saw during Trump's entire time in office. And as he moves towards, again, running for president, very likely again in 2024, and actually I have heard from people here at CPAC, including people who claim, and very credibly claim, they met Trump at Mar-a-Lago, claim that Trump has stated to them personally that he plans on running for president again in 2024, and again backing these different officials for 2022 to try to retake the House and the Senate. You're going to see Trump campaigning. You're going to see MAGA rallies. You're going to see grassroots activism. You're going to see Trump engaging in, things that typically were involved, were more like the far left doing. Things like, for example, these whole engaging the grassroots nonprofit sector, community organizing, like Saul Alinsky type stuff. You're going to see him getting involved in that. Really, you're about to see an entire different element of the movement that Trump started, this MAGA movement, taking not just the top-down approach, but the bottom-up approach. And that bottom-up approach is what really changes a country. And so, get ready for it. I know it feels right now that a lot of conservatives feel they're under attack. A lot of conservatives right now feel that there's no hope. A lot of them feel that nobody's on their side right now. This may change very soon. All right, folks. Really, always enjoy talking with y'all. If anyone's here at CPAC, come say hi. I'll be on Broadcast Row. I have a booth there doing interviews. Come say hi. I'll be around. And as always, folks, I'll be doing these live Q&As Sunday, Tuesday, and Thursday, 10:30 p.m. Eastern time. So be sure to tune in again on Sunday, and that'll be after Trump speaks, hopefully on Sunday, and so I can give you all an update on that. That said, as always, please take care of yourselves, stay informed, and stay free. Thank you.